Welcome to the New York Business Leaders Podcast, presented by the Coyle Group. We interview the most interesting and influential business leaders in New York and hear their stories of success, challenges, and lessons learned while building their businesses and personal brands. New episodes drop weekly, so please be sure to subscribe to get updates in your favorite stream. Without further delay, here's your host of the New York Business Leaders Podcast, Gordon Coyle.
Welcome back to the New York Business Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Gordon Coyle. In this episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with my friend Julie Lusthouse from Lusthouse Law, located in Westchester County, New York. Julie is known in our networking circles as the franchise attorney, and we spend most of our time talking about the franchise world on both sides of the transaction, the franchisors and the franchisees. We talk about how franchises get started, when successful business owners want to expand their firms and their reach. We talk about the regulatory issues, the potential pitfalls, how to understand the risks for both the franchisor and the franchisees when entering into agreements, and much more. The bottom line is that franchise law is highly specialized, and this is why Julie spends most of her time focusing just on that. Really interesting stuff here. I want to include my typical disclaimer when hosting an attorney on the show that nothing in this conversation should be considered legal advice. If you have an issue, a question, or a problem regarding franchises, reach out to Julie directly. You can go to her website, which is lusthouselawpc.com. That's LUSTHAUSLAWPC.com. Or you can email her at jl@lusthouselawpc.com. Or you can call her at 914-265-4100. Before we jump into the conversation, let me say, if you have an interesting story that you'd like to tell on this show, why not reach out to me and let's chat. My email address is gbcoyle@thecoilegroup.com, and my direct dial is 845-474-2924. Thanks for watching or listening. Please be sure to leave a review or a thumbs up. Thank you. And now on to the show. Julie Lusthouse, welcome to the New York Business Leaders Podcast. How's it going?
Thanks, Gordon. It's great to be here.
Glad to have you. So as we kick off, why don't we take a couple of minutes, introduce yourself, and tell our audience what you do.
Sure. So I am principal of Lusthouse Law. I am a franchise attorney, and I work with clients who are expanding their businesses through franchising, or who are looking to buy or are selling their business and buying franchises, developing franchise locations.
So let's kick off. Why is franchise law its own animal?
That's a great question. So franchising is highly regulated in the US. There is a federal law that applies to the sale of franchises that are going to be operated anywhere in the US. We refer to that as the FTC rule, and that's a rule that's rendered by the Federal Trade Commission. There are also state laws that apply to the sale of franchises, as well as state laws that apply to the relationship between the franchisor and franchisee. And so, for instance, if you have a franchise contract and the franchisee is in default and the franchisor wants to terminate the franchisee, there could be laws that will trump the contract provision and prevent the franchisor from terminating, or may require the franchisor to give certain notice. But generally speaking, it's a highly regulated field. It's based on securities law. And when it comes to selling franchises, franchisors have to give prospective franchisees a disclosure document which contains information about the franchisor and the offering and copies of the agreements and so forth. And they have to do that before they can sign a franchise agreement with a franchisee or accept any money.
So a highly nuanced area of business law.
I think that's right.
And that's why a lot of other attorneys don't get into it. And that's where your referrals come from probably most of the time. Is that right?
That is right. It's one of those areas where lawyers tend not to dabble because it's just so highly regulated and nuanced. And there are, some significant risks associated with selling franchises out, when not in compliant with applicable law. Franchisors can face a lot of liability in the event, if they inadvertently sell a franchise without complying with the law.
And I would imagine that a lot of these regulatory bodies and rules and laws that came about were because there was some unsavory work going on in the franchising industry.
Right. So it started, the law started in the early 70s. And it was before that, there was a lot of sale of franchises where there were representations made to the buyer about, how much money they were going to earn, about famous people who were involved with the particular franchise system, and so forth. And so states and the federal, the FTC realized that this is an industry that's ripe for
abuse.
Yes.
I hear the faint calling of pyramid schemes.
Exactly. Yes. And so in order to protect the investor, and that's the thing, the franchise laws are consumer protection laws, and they are intended to protect the investor. And as a result of that, even when you have sophisticated parties to the contract, some of the laws prohibit the waiver of a right that's granted under the statute. So even if a prospective franchisee were to say to the franchisor, it's okay, you don't have to give me the disclosure document, I'm totally fine with moving forward without getting it, that's not something that they can waive. And so, if the franchisor were to proceed and there were to be a problem, the franchisor would be at risk for liability under the law because they did not give a franchise disclosure document, even though the franchisee said they didn't care.
Got it. Okay. Now, in the past, we've talked about, a lot of people, and you've said, I don't remember your phrase exactly. Most people think of franchises as food service.
Burgers and fries.
Burgers and fries.
Burgers and fries.
Which we all love. But give us an idea of other franchises and franchisors that you're working with, and what's in the market, what's really popular today.
Okay, so franchising crosses all industries. I think, generally what it takes for there to be a franchise business is that the business has to be easily replicable, right? You have to be able to teach the franchisee how to operate the business relatively quickly. And there has the business model has to work so that the franchisee can make money and also pay fees to the franchisor for the right to use the system. But franchising crosses all industries. It's certainly restaurants, quick service restaurants, but also home health and fitness, like gyms and cleaning and professional services, pet services, childcare, tutoring, education, family entertainment centers. It really is, and that's what's so fascinating for me, because when I'm working with a client, no matter what the industry is, the issues that we're dealing with are franchise issues. But I get to learn a little bit more about a new industry each time, and that's really fun. We've even recently had some in the medical industry, in medical profession, which is really complicated but really interesting, because there's so many laws about who can own a medical practice and how you can share fees and so forth. And so franchising in that industry is really fascinating. As far as what's popular, I will say that, after COVID, it seemed as though a lot of the grab and go, quick service type places really did well. The acai bowls and the places where you order your food and you pick it up and you go, those certainly did well and continue to do well. I have seen these days more in like health and wellness. So not just the massage type places, but also some with like cryotherapy and interesting new health and wellness concepts are coming out. But it's always interesting when there's a trend. People always ask me, what franchise should I buy? And I said, not my lane. It really, because there are some that are trendy and they're hot and everybody buys in and it doesn't last. And then there are certainly some that have been around that we all know that have been around forever. So, it takes doing your due diligence. That's for sure.
That's an interesting parallel between our businesses. What I really enjoy about the insurance business is working with different clients every day and learning about what they do and how they do it. It could be, just kind of looking at the accounts I'm working on right now would be, an auto restoration shop or a private investment fund or a big real estate account or a real estate management company. So it's just, that variety every day that keeps it interesting and keeps it going that I think is good for both of us. Now, something that you mentioned earlier is franchising as a method of expanding somebody's business. So you have a successful business that may fit the franchise model and you say, oh, I'm going to franchise this. Like, how does that work? And how do they get to you? I guess that's the connection too.
So, one of the things that I like to talk to clients about who are considering franchising is becoming a franchisor is a different business than operating their existing business, right? So they have to be prepared for that and ready for that. But generally, when you think about what is a franchise, let's just be clear here, because oftentimes, I'll get clients who are trying to avoid the franchise laws and so want to kind of expand that way, but not really.
And they say not really because they don't want to go through all of the regulatory hassle.
Exactly.
Okay.
Generally speaking, there are 3 elements to a franchise, right? There's the right to use a trademark or name, a brand. There's, some sort of method of operation that you're going to use in your business. If it's a restaurant, like recipes and maybe trade dress the way your restaurant looks and so forth, in exchange for a fee. And so if you have those 3 elements, you're likely to be selling a franchise. Okay. So even when you have somewhat a situation where you're operating your restaurant, you have a few locations open, you've decided that you want to start franchising, or what typically happens is someone comes to your restaurant and says, this is awesome, I want to open one, right? How can I open one? Or even, can we be partners? Let's join together and open one at another location, right? That could be creating a franchise relationship. So that's often how franchisors get the idea. But really, it's the ability to expand your brand using other people's money, sweat equity, right? They're going to operate independent businesses. So the franchisor doesn't have the risk of the lease and the employees and so forth. And they're going to, license their brand, their method to the franchisee who's going to pay them fees in exchange for the right to operate that way. A lot of times franchisors will have a trademark attorney, right? So a lot of times they have a trademark in place and they want to start expanding. And so their trademark attorney is likely to recognize that they may be coming close to franchising and they may bring me on. Or a client wants to start franchising and doesn't know where to start, and they find a franchise attorney like me, either referred through their counsel or accountant or a friend or so forth, or Google. And then we talk about really what's involved in franchising and how extensive the work is before you can really even engage in conversation about a franchise.
So give me an idea of what are the pitfalls or what are the warning signs, the red flags that an investor wants to get involved with a franchise? What do you see as the red flags that people should be aware of?
So I think so when I put my franchisee lawyer hat on, what I look for, first, I want to make sure that the client understands that while they're going to be operating their own business, their franchisor really can control a lot of their operations. And so franchising is fantastic for someone who wants to be handed the playbook and who will follow along and who will work hard at their business. But someone who's very entrepreneurial and who loves to come up with their own ideas and implement new things and try things along the way, franchising may not be for them because they won't have the kind of independence that they may want.
I think that's
So
a
we
great
talk
point
about
to make.
that.
Yeah.
And then once they're sure that they're interested in buying a franchise, we look at the franchise disclosure document and look at, if there's anything in there that's outside the realm of norm that I don't normally see, right? That's going to be a red flag. But otherwise, I walk them through the documents and make sure they really understand their rights and obligations. A franchise relationship is a long-term relationship. It's not like you sign a contract, you buy a business, seller goes away, and you're free. So it's really important that clients understand what they're committing to, because frequently a franchisee does not have the contractual right to terminate the relationship. So what happens if things don't go well? You want to make sure you understand your risks and what you can do. Or what if you want to pass your business down to your grandchildren, 30 years from now? Do you have the right to do that, right? So depending on what their particular area of concern is, as we go through the documents, we talk through those issues and see if there's a way to address them with the franchisor.
So just it's something you said, I want to clarify. The franchisee cannot just terminate a contract with the franchisor.
Frequently, that is the case.
They feel like they're in this 3 or 4 years, it's not working, I don't have enough customers, I'm losing my shirt on this deal, I want out. Can't do it?
That's a problem.
That's a problem.
It depends, and so what I tell clients is, if there's an issue, if you're operating a franchise and there is an issue, like call me, call your lawyer, don't wait. Don't put your head in the sand. Let's address it as soon as we can, or not. But you want to make sure you're not waiving your right to address it if there's a short contractual limitation period, or if there's some sort of, if the franchisor violated a sales law, you have a limited amount of time to address that. So, if you've got a problem, pick up the phone because, the sooner that we can address it with the franchisor. The franchisor typically wants their franchisees to be successful, right? So a good franchisor will want to work with them. And it just really depends on the relationship, on the franchisee, the franchisor, where the location is. There's so many factors that, it's really very fact specific. And so it's important to, address things as they come up and not wait till it's too late.
Yeah, I think that's good business advice that every professional probably gives their clients. Don't wait until this thing is lit on fire before you decide you're going to call me.
Right. Can I have insurance after the fire starts, or no? It doesn't work that way.
I actually had one of those calls today. I want to go back to the things that make a franchise successful in terms of like scale. How many units? I don't know if this is a general question you can even answer, but when a franchisor comes to you and says, I've got this great idea, I run this business, I want to expand it, I want to franchise it. I'm sure it kind of depends on the industry, but how many units does a franchisor need to make it really work and be worth the time and effort, generally speaking?
So that's a good question. And I've heard numbers, high numbers for, tens of units before they are royalty revenue free, like they're surviving on royalty revenue. So, it could be tens, 80, I've heard.
Wow.
It's a lot before the
Yeah.
franchisor is really successfully operating based on revenue derived from the franchise.
And do you ever see, venture capital or private equity money going into these deals to expand a business into the franchise world?
Yes. So that became really popular in the past few years. We get a lot of private equity on both sides. So not only on the franchisor side, but on the franchisee side. where private equity funds are buying into, brands and looking to develop, 30, 40, 50 units and
Wow.
more.
Okay.
And there are private equity firms that, that's where their focus is
Interesting.
franchising.
And then how do they exit those stores if their average hold time is 6 or 7 years? Or is this a different PE model?
Well, not necessarily, no. I think that, that's why it's important to have franchise counsel when they're acquiring their rights from the beginning, because factoring in their exit strategy and making sure that they have as much flexibility as possible is something that they're going to want to focus on, and they have the leverage to do that before they buy in.
Mhm.
So, I work with a lot of large multi-unit and multi-brand operators to help them with this very issue. There are other issues that come up for them also, like non-competes. If they have a portfolio with, more than one restaurant in it, we have to make sure we address that with both franchisors, right? It's not just the new one, but what about the existing franchisor? What limitations do they have? Issues about transfer, and as you just mentioned, if they want out and they're going to want to sell, what's going to be required in order for them to sell.
I mean, interesting things that you have to kind of have some foresight on. You have to look down the road and kind of manage all those potential contract risks that are going to be embedded in the franchisor's agreement. Things like non-compete, like you mentioned, I could imagine a large buyer tripping over themselves and saying, "Oh crap, we bought a store in this vicinity or locale. Now we can't expand this other brand in the same area because we'll be violating the agreement unless that's prearranged and pre-okayed by both of the franchisors."
And I think what happens for multi-brand operators is that there's no more territory available. Right? If you're gonna bring a concept to market in a particular, let's say Long Island, New York, right? And you develop all the locations and there's just no more territory available, but you want to keep growing your portfolio, you're gonna have to turn to another brand. So, how do you do that if you're subject to restrictions by your first franchisor? And a lot of times I see that the operators are not so much thinking about their existing agreements with their current franchisor. They're focused on the new agreement, the new franchisor, making sure they're agreeing to stuff, right? But you have to also go back and look at their old agreement and say, wait a second, you're subject to this, this, and this in your old agreement. You got to make sure your current franchisor is okay with this, or you're going to be in default under your existing franchise agreements.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So you got to look at all of it.
And if you're in a saturated market, like you mentioned, like Nassau County as an example, that could be pretty difficult to grow a new brand for an investor.
Right.
Amazing. Interesting. So Julie, tell us a little bit about the laws that govern franchisees and franchisors. Like, give us a little high level overview of it. Don't inundate us.
Okay. So like I said, there's the FTC rule that applies to the sale of franchises that'll be operated in the US. And that rule requires the provision of a franchise disclosure document to franchisees before they buy the franchise.
And that's federal level.
That's federal level.
Okay.
There are approximately 13 states, plus Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, I think, which require that franchisors, to some extent, register their offering with the state before they sell the franchise. So, you have to submit the FDD to the state that you're going to sell franchises in. And
FDD is
the franchise disclosure document.
Okay.
That's what it used to be a uniform franchise offering circular. A UFOC, we called it, but now we've moved on to franchise disclosure document, FDD.
Okay.
And so in addition to registering with the state, there's rules around the sale process. There's timing requirements that franchisors have to give the FDD a certain amount of time before they can sign a contract with a franchisee. There's information that they if they're going to give that information at all, it has to be in the FDD. If they don't include it in the FDD, they can't give that financial information about the franchise offering. And so there's rules around the sales process. And so one of the things I do with my new franchise or clients is help them with the sales training, the legal sales compliance, so that they are aware of what the rules are and don't inadvertently sell a franchise in violation of the law. There's, on the other hand, you have what we refer to as the relationship laws, which several states have, which really control or impact the franchisor's ability to terminate a franchisee or not renew the franchisee, or what requirements, if they, there's requirements against discrimination among franchisees. And so it really, those talk to the relationship of the parties. And whether or not the laws apply can get complicated. So, in New York, for instance, we have a Franchise Sales Act, which regulates the sale of franchises. Well, if I'm a New Jersey franchisor and you're an Ohio franchisee and you're going to operate in Ohio, but we happen to meet up in New York, where I offer you the franchise and you accept in New York, the New York law is going to apply. Oh. So, you could be sitting on vacation in Hawaii, which has a franchise sales law. And if I'm engaged in sales discussions with you about the franchise offering, I could very well be triggering the Hawaii law, which requires me to register in Hawaii. So figuring out which laws applies and what laws you have to comply with is its whole world unto itself. Amazing. Yeah.
So when you start working with a franchisor, do you prepare 13 different state documents, or kind of base it on what the franchise anticipation of his marketing territory is going to be? But you must have to have a tremendous volume of documentation that has to be produced.
So fortunately, there is essentially a form FDD that we can use in all of the states. Okay. But that being said, each state has its own addenda that might have to be included. And sometimes you get into a situation where you submit your document to 2 different states and the regulators want you to make changes that are like inconsistent. And you have to either then have 2 different FDDs, one for one state and one the other, which is complicated for the client, or have a discussion with the regulators and see if you can't get them to agree that the change in the document would be included on the state addenda, or, will they agree to let the other states request, rule the day. So generally speaking, we try to have one document that the franchisor can use. It can get really unwieldy if they have all different versions that they have to use in different states, if they're going to sell in more than one state.
And what about states that are outside of the 13 that have FDD rules?
So those just require the FDD be delivered to the franchisee within a certain amount of time before they sign the franchise agreement. And so we refer to those as non-registration states. And so you can have an FDD that you can use in non-registration states. And if you're selling in states where there's no franchise sales law, then you don't have to register anywhere. You have to create the document, which, by the way, contains 23 items of information, plus financial statements of the franchisor, plus a copy of the franchise agreement and other agreements that the franchisee may have to sign. So they tend to be a couple hundred pages.
I was going to say, it's probably pretty similar to a prospectus to an investment fund.
Exactly how it originated.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
Okay. So I interrupted you. So in those states that are not registry states, you don't need that document.
You do need the document.
Oh, you do need the document.
You just don't have to file. You don't have to register it anywhere. You don't have to file it with any regulators.
Okay.
There's no government entity looking at it.
Oh, that's right, because there's still the federal guidance that has to be followed. And at that point, I'm imagining a state like Wyoming doesn't have this. They're pretty free of regulations, having been out there last summer. It's pretty much a tax-free state. It's a free-for-all state. So you're going to give us the word on it. But let's say the franchisor is in New York. Was I right?
You are right. When it comes to sales laws, you are right.
Okay. So if you have a multiple state franchisor, do you use the state that the franchisor is domiciled in for those non-registry states?
So if the franchisor is going to be selling franchises in multiple states, what matters is, for the most part, what matters, well, I mean, where the franchisor is selling will also impact what state applies. But the goal is to have one FDD that is registered in all of the states where this franchisor is going to be selling, so that you have one document that you're giving to all your prospects.
That may have 12 addendums to it or something
Correct.
like that.
It has all the state addenda, and those just don't apply if the franchisee is not, if the law doesn't apply to a particular franchise.
Got it. Okay. So
I just will say that franchisors have to update their FDD every year and
No kidding.
refile in many states each year.
Now that's only for new sales going forward. Those don't have to be re-signed by the existing franchisees,
Correct.
because the original FDD is what governs that relationship.
Correct. But to be clear, because I can't help myself, it's the franchise agreement is what controls the relationship. And that was signed when they bought the franchise. And that is an exhibit in the FDD.
Okay.
The FDD itself is disclosure. It's just information that doesn't get signed.
So we're talking about like multiple encyclopedias that need to be created. Is that what you're telling us?
Well, it does take a little time.
So we've kind of talked about the pitfalls, the red flags, the warning signs for franchisee when they're getting involved in investment. We talked about it, PEs and other investment groups buying into the model. Who else are your typical franchisee purchasers? Do they have any particular similarities, commonalities?
I mean, I think no, right? So you get a lot of people who want to leave the corporate world and who want to own a business or businesses without having to reinvent the wheel. You get, younger entrepreneurs who are looking to buy a couple and hopefully grow into multi-unit and multi-brand ownership. But, again, I think it's important for the franchisee to think about, are they going to be comfortable with the fact that the franchisor has some control? And oftentimes they want the franchisor to give them advice and to give them training and it's almost turnkey, right? This is what kind of lease you want, this is the location you kind of want to look for, and this is how big it should be, and this is the equipment you need, and then you're going to build out, and here's the software you're going to use, and the POS system you should have. And so it's wonderful. And good franchisors are incredibly supportive, and they care about their brand and they care about their franchisees. And that's wonderful. And then as they grow, franchisors get bought and sold. And that's always an interesting issue for the franchisees. So that's another time when I have, the clients come to me is they get word that their franchisor is about to sell. And they want to know sort of what impact that's going to have on them and their business, because that happens too.
Yeah, I would imagine that the franchisees would maybe a little nervous about what's the new personality leadership going to be like. Are we going to go from this kind of familial relationship to hostile? Who knows? That would worry me.
It's a concern, and that's why it's so important to think about those kinds of things before you buy and address some of those issues if you can with the franchisor before you buy in, because ultimately current management could be fantastic, but if they sell, right, and you're stuck with new management, the only protection a franchisee is going to have is what's in their franchise agreement. Right. So you really want to make sure that you get whatever protection you can on the franchisee side.
Right.
On the franchisor side, I will just say that it's really important that you try to keep the agreements consistent. It's hard to be a franchisor with all different franchise agreements.
A
with
million different side
forms and-
deals.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think that it's interesting, the two buyer groups that you kind of identify, the ex-corporate folks that left that world and they want a turnkey business versus the, a younger group of people that want to, take a brand and grow it. I think it's interesting. And I'm sure that there's millions of people in between. I know for me, I like to do things the difficult way, and I like to be entrepreneurial and be difficult myself. I don't know if I'd fit the box. You just have to be self-aware.
And that's one of the things I try to help clients figure out in the process up into signing, whether that's, and the franchisors need to think about who's a good candidate. What does a good candidate look like for their brand? What are they looking for? Some franchisors are only interested in larger multi-unit operators, right? They want more sophisticated owners. Other franchisors want, someone who's going to open the business and operate it themselves and be invested personally and be really committed to the brand in that way.
Mm-hmm. Interesting stuff. All right. I want to be respectful of time. Is there anything I didn't bring up or ask you about that you want to kind of put on the table regarding what you do? For those that are on a podcast and only listening, she's shaking her head no.
Please edit that. That was this. That was not this. Thank you, Gordon. It was really wonderful being here. I appreciate your time, and it was really fun.
I'm glad you think so. It was a good conversation. I think it's interesting because, I work with businesses all day long. I know a little bit about it. I know some of it from what you've told me in our conversations, but I think it's a very interesting field. And, I think it could be really rewarding, like you talked about, or it could be really dangerous for the wrong candidates to get involved in these things. So the bottom line is that if on both sides of the coin, if you have a business that you want to grow through franchising, speak to somebody like Julie. If you're looking at buying a franchise, again, work with a franchise attorney, somebody that's been through this a million times that can say, these are red flags, these are danger, zones. You don't want to do this. Maybe these are things we need to negotiate. So great information, Julie. I appreciate you taking time with us today. So Julie, if people are watching or listening to this podcast and they wanted to reach out and get in touch, what's the best way to do that?
So if they would like information about my services and my firm, they can look at my website at lusthouselawpc.com. And they can also always email me at jl@lusthouselawpc.com. And I look forward to hearing from them.
Great. I'll put your website and your email address in the show notes so that it's there in case somebody isn't, able to write it down while they're in the car or something like that. And in closing, my name is Gordon Coyle. I'm the host of the New York Business Leaders Podcast. If you have an interesting story that you'd like to tell on this podcast, I'd love to have you. Give me a call, drop me an email. My contact info will be in the show notes, and let's chat. Thanks. And until next time, stay well.
That's it for this week's episode of the New York Business Leaders Podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode. In the meantime, find more interviews and resources at nybusinessleaders.com.